Hey, this is StarCraft 2 History, and this one is going to be about Thorzain. And Thorzain was a foreigner Terran player, very few of those. And he was very good in the early parts of StarCraft 2, specifically in 2011 and one tournament in 2012. And so I was going to talk about him because the DreamHack Stockholm he wins is thematically not connected to really anything in that year, because soon after Zergs would start dominating, and before then, like, Thorzain himself was having a rough drought of results. And so I'm going to talk about Thorzain a bit because he's an interesting character as both a person, a player, and what he means to the scene. So Thorzain, he comes out of TSL3, which is the thing everybody should remember him the most for, because even though it was an online tournament, it was a big deal back in the day, as there was very little foreigner and Korean crossover between the players. And what made Thorzain so special was he actually had a very tough bracket. He beat Fruit Dealer, he beat he beat Naniwa, I believe he beat MC, yeah, MC for sure. And he beat a number of pretty good foreigner players. Noni at the time, Kaz also. And so and that kind of made his name. And the reason he became such a huge household name right after winning TSL3 was because his run through there was kind of a miracle, because nobody had expected him to win, because nobody had ever heard of him before. But after that, he doesn't really have that many notable tournament results, and what I mean by that is top 8 or higher, because that's generally how I rate it. He in IPL2, which is another online league, he gets 4th, but that was all foreigners. In NASL Season 2, he actually gets 4th. Decent run, beats the Muslim, beats Morrow, loses to Puma, basically. And after that, he wins DreamHack Stockholm, which was an overhyped achievement. And that's actually something that happens a lot in StarCraft 2, where if you're a popular player, it's a little bit more so for foreigners, but it also applies to Koreans, where if you win a tournament, your achievement is overhyped a bit. And so, for instance, this Stockholm, if you want, you can look at the bracket. He basically gets to the playoffs. He beats Cytoplasm, Zerg, Sock, Protoss, who was on his way out, Monster, decent, Korean, and then Pult. Very legit win over Pult. And so that's not a very, in my opinion, that's not a very good bracket run when we're talking about the all-time great bracket runs, especially for foreigners. For instance, Snoot in 2015 beat the 2 best PvZ players at that time, Classic and Rain. So it was godly, in my opinion. But this one was just not as good. Pult was a legit win, but it's not like Pult was going to be a world beater, not in that era. And the reason this one was overhyped was obviously because it was in Sweden and he was a Swedish player, so everybody was riding that hype train. And people still to this day rank him above a bunch of other better foreigner players for my money, because they consider it a big win. And this is kind of how he kind of represents weird sort of sensationalized hype for very popular players, where if you actually break down their brackets, break down their runs, break down who they were playing in what meta, it's not as impressive as it as the feels of what people thought it was at the time. And that's kind of what he represented to me, because I feel like even though he was a very good player, and you have to give him the caveat, he was a Terran player, which was historically speaking the hardest race to play for a foreigner player. Just look at the results of all the best foreigner players there. It's Jinro early on, Thorzain, and Bunny, and then you've run out, basically. You've run out of all the all-time great Terran foreigner players. Even Neeb, who everybody praises as one of the best foreigners of all time, he had to switch to Protoss because he couldn't cut it as a Terran player. So that kind of tells you a little bit about what it meant to be a Terran player. And so that's he in a sense he represents that part of the community. But in another sense, I'm going to talk about Thorzain as a player because he has a very interesting mind, and he's the first person that really makes me understand that it's really about your mental Jedi mind tricks that get you out of pressure. Because this was a player who he constantly, in my opinion, he overplayed or like played better against players that the community perceived as favorites against him. So long as Thorzain thought he was the underdog, he did very well. And so long as everybody thought Thorzain was the favorite, he'd do poorly. And then he actually explained this in an interview once where he felt that because there was no pressure to perform against a favorite, he could just play more loose, more calm, more composed. But against a player everybody thought he was going to win against, he felt like he had a lot more to lose, a lot more reputation, a lot more, and much less to gain from that kind of victory. So it's kind of interesting because there are other players who actually gain confidence from beating down weaker players and lose confidence when they go up against the better players. So in that sense, Thorzain was the first one to teach me that it's really about how you frame your mental war in these games, and so long as you can control that, you can kind of control your nerves or your pressure, right? And now I'm going to talk about Thorzain as a player because I think he's actually one of the most interesting players to think about, because there's very few that play like him even to this day, even though like, yeah, you have a lot of late mech players that come around towards the end of Heart of the Swarm and Legacy of the Void, but Thorzain was actually a late bio player, late bio player, which is very rare. Like the only other player you can put in that category is Tasia, basically, and Tasia was a very different player from Thorzain because Thorzain was a guy who was kind of obsessed with not giving away advantages, and so so every time he got an advantage, he would never parlay that into an attack that could win the game or could do massive damage. He'd parlay that into another small advantage in his own economy, in his own army composition, and maybe his positioning on the map. And this is always how he played. And because he constantly did it this way, he gained the nickname the like Spoon Terran in Korea, because it felt like he was killing his opponent with a spoon, just like slowly hitting him over and over and over again. So it was very unique style that isn't really seen, not even like in the mech styles of later on. And Thorzain was also the second player I'd ever seen after QXE use late game Reapers and understand how like destructive they could be if you could get to them. Like, because there's a huge timing window where if you make the Reapers from your barracks, it takes like 90 seconds to like 2 minutes, I believe, to like get enough Reapers to really have a destructive marauding force that can destroy the entire opponent's army base before they could get back and protect it, because Reapers can jump, and back then they did like with the +3 upgrade, I think they did like 55 damage a hit, and so if you have like 12 of those, that's a shit ton of damage to building. So he was that type of player. And the last bit you want to talk about Thorzain is like his rivalry with Naniwa, because I feel this actually plays into his mindset, where on some level I do think Thorzain might believe Naniwa was the favorite because he always played very well against Naniwa, and just the way he played in general, that kind of fits into there. But Thorzain as a player would never admit Naniwa was better because they really hated each other on some kind of personal level, and maybe and definitely like a competitive level, they were definitely rivals. And so the two of them kind of have one of the most interesting sort of dynamics in StarCraft 2, just the way their styles play out, because Thorzain was his late game player, but more on the big picture. Naniwa was an early to mid game player, in my opinion. Like he could play later, but that was where he really shined. Like it was about his micro, it was about his army control, it was about refining the builds to the T, whereas Thorzain was about the big picture shit. And they both actually had their own like unique brands of StarCraft 2, and so when they collide against each other, it always bring out very interesting games. and then it kind of fueled their own personal rivalry against each other because since they were both like the best Swedish players, there was always this constant rivalry, a question of who was the better one. And because, like I said, Thorzain was the more popular one, everybody always sided with Thorzain. But Naniwa knew, and I think if you were like an elitist StarCraft player and you just looked at who they were playing, how they were playing, I'd say Naniwa was probably the better one. But because Thorzain was more popular, it always kind of grinded Naniwa's gears a little bit. Like, where's my respect? I am the one. I am the best. And so that's kind of their rivalry in retrospect. And it's interesting because Thorzain was such a composed character, except when it came to Naniwa. And I guess you can say the same about a lot of different foreigners because Naniwa he was always such a brash, sort of unfiltered personality. Like that's how I'd put it. And because he had like such a competitive spirit, there was something both likable and hateable about him for the rest of the competitive scene. Because I'll talk about it later, but basically Naniwa has both like the greatest virtue and like the worst virtue of a competitive personality, in that he has like something everybody wishes they had, but like that something causes a bunch of different problems in the rest of his life because he's so concentrated on competition. At least at the time, it's probably different now, given that he's basically retired. So that's in my opinion the crux of Thorzain's career as a player, as a legacy. I'd say he's still probably in the top 15. I have top 15 greatest foreigners of all time. I haven't really redone the list, so I'd have to go back and check. Like, for instance, I'm almost certain Nurchill would get a bump up. I think Scarlett's about the same because she was already 5th, and well, I'd have to look at that again. Measure her against I think I had Huck 4th. But anyway, ignoring all that, there's one last funny tidbit I will say about Thorzain was he did play in the Kespa Pro League for a while, and he famously got a victory against Classic in a TVT, and that's actually one of Thorzain's better matchups. Classic would subsequently decide, Terran's not for me, I lost to a foreigner. Then he would change to Protoss and become one of the best Protoss players in the entire world. Very similar to Neeb in that sense. And also, he also got a backhanded compliment from Kespa because he was given the MVP award, even though he only won one game. And it was like kind of backhanded, but you know what? He took it. And that's Thorzain's career in a nutshell. Still, in my opinion, player you might want to go back to watch because there's nobody that really plays like him to this day. All right. See you guys later.